broadcasting from the Unshackled Studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront, brought to you by theunshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello and welcome to Friday night's WilmsFront. The date is Friday the 1st of November 2019. It is 7 p.m. here in Melbourne. We are live on the Tim Wilms YouTube channel, and we are also live on Entropy, which is the YouTube enhanced software where you can send through your questions to me or the guests we have lined up for tonight, or you can also send through a super chat to financially support the show and the Unshackled. Now, obviously, today is the first day of November, which means, of course, it's Movember, which is men grow moustaches and they can be sponsored, and you can don't pledge money towards men's mental health. Now, of course, men's mental health is a worthwhile initiative. However, I will not be growing a mo because I hate beards and moustaches. So the rest of you guys, learn how to groom. It's the 21st century. There's a whole industry of shavers and other grooming devices. Just take 10 minutes out of your day to just make yourself look good, like I try to do. And of course, Cup Week begins tomorrow with Derby Day at Flemington Racecourse, with the Melbourne Cup on Tuesday. And of course, at the same time, that's when the Reserve Bank of Australia meets to decide what the interest rate will be. Currently, it is 0.75%, Australia's interest rate. It could get even lower. We're going to get that to with my guest shortly. There is a lot of people changing their Facebook profiles to Nut to the Cup. This is because there has been recent expose of horse cruelty in the racing industry, a lot of them being sent, or these racehorses, to the slaughterhouse, and a lot of abuse towards them. It's interesting, the IMARC protesters, that is of course the Marxists and socialists who tried to blockade the entrance to this mining conference at the Melbourne Exhibition and Convention Centre. They're actually going to be protesting the Melbourne Cup and animal cruelty next week, even though many of them have been charged for kicking police horses. So they're against horse cruelty, but then just this week they've been kicking police horses. It doesn't make sense. But I actually think that more animals should be brought to Flemington, because remember those police sniffer dogs, which are always at music festivals, where obviously a lot of attendees, they take drugs in to use, and they have the sniffer dogs there to try and detect them. There's a lot of arrests and sometimes tragically overdoses and hospitalizations. Well, I actually think those police sniffer dogs should be sent to the Melbourne Cup, but because I think they would catch a lot of people, but they might be a lot of high profile and elites there, and so if they're all arrested, it might be a bit embarrassing, I would say, for a lot of high society people, which is interesting. We don't see them at the Melbourne Cup at all, even though if you wanted to enforce the drug laws and continue the drug war, you would. But on with tonight's feature guest. First up, so Bitcoin is the world's most popular cryptocurrency. It is now 10 years old. It was created by developers known under the pseudonym as Satoshi Nakamoto. I knew I'd mispronounced that.
Nakamoto.
Yes. And I have with me tonight probably the world's best Bitcoin educator, expert, media personality, Stephan Livera.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I wouldn't say I'm quite the best, but very flattering.
Well, your podcast, which is, well, it's under your name. It's over 100 episodes now. It's got basically a 5-star rating. It's one of the most popular ones, Bitcoin podcasts in the world. You speak at Bitcoin and cryptocurrency conferences all over the globe, and of course you're one of the founders of Ministry of Nodes, which is actually a Bitcoin education organization, which I was just checking it out. You definitely need some sort of online academy, like how Tom Woods has Liberty Classroom, and of course there's Learn Liberty, and of course Jason Stapleton has his online entrepreneur academy. Is that something that's in the works?
We've got, I mean, it's at this point, it's just getting started with that. So we are thinking about different ideas on that. At this point, it's more just like webinar coaching and also other materials like articles and YouTube resources that will help a person take their own sovereignty back into their own hands and use that to basically be a fully fledged Bitcoin citizen, if you will.
Well, you're going to be doing a bit of a webinar to me and my audience tonight, because even though I've been in the libertarian scene for nearly a decade myself, and you and I met at the Australian Libertarian Freedman Conference that was a number of years ago, and because we're both Austro libertarians, we sort of gravitated towards that sort of social grouping at the conference, and we all got along like a house on fire. As much as I recall, we just chatted about obviously the trends that were going on at the time, and obviously the Austrian, because Austrian economics is just one school of libertarian thought. There's obviously the Chicago school, and there's a whole bunch of others. But Austrians, they're very smart and entrepreneurial people, and obviously they're not too concerned about optics. They know that they've always been the outsiders.
Yeah, there's definitely a bit of a sense of that. I think from my point of view, there are a lot of insights that the Austrian school can bring, and they can help us understand why Bitcoin is so important and help us understand Bitcoin from the right point of view. And that's why with my podcast, I really bring a lot of Austrian economics alongside the technical components, the computer science and those aspects of Bitcoin. And I sort of meld them together in the way that I interview my guests. And some of my guests are Austrian economists, and then some of them are more from the computer science, technical, networking, distributed systems, that side of this world, as well as various business entrepreneurs within Bitcoin. So that's but I think to your point around Austro-libertarianism, yes, it's only one part of the broader libertarian movement, if you will.
I remember there were countless sessions on Bitcoin at the various libertarian conferences I've attended over the years. It never really interests me, just because it was all so technical and a geeky discussion. But Bitcoin and the larger cryptocurrency industry is now as big as ever. And of course, the reason why Austrians and other libertarians are attracted to Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is because they're currencies which are not issued by the state, or a central bank. You don't need to use a commercial or merchant bank, and it's a safeguard against inflation, which of course is the secret tax, or we should call it a theft, because it's obviously when your taxes are coming out of your paycheck, but you don't know that the dollars that you're holding in your hand are slowly decreasing in value. And everyone, the standard thing is, the price of Coke went up from $3 to $3.30. Oh, that's greedy Coke again. No, that's inflation.
Yeah, so I'm actually puzzled why more libertarians are not into Bitcoin. I sense that the people who are in Bitcoin, there's a high percentage of libertarians who are in Bitcoin, but I would say there's a large amount of libertarians who, maybe as you were getting to this point as well, because it's quite technical to understand Bitcoin. And so to some extent, I try to help break that down for people and help make that easier for them to understand. But the sad reality is right now it is a bit more technical and it takes a bit of work. It will eventually get easier and things will get abstracted away and it'll be happening all under the hood. A good analogy would be you use SMTP all the time. It's just that Gmail is handling that email protocol for you in the background and you don't have to worry about it. You just hit compose and off you go, right? You send your email. Same way with Bitcoin. It's not quite at that point yet where it's, grandma can use it. There are efforts being made on it. And it offers an incredible amount of freedom once you know how to use it. It takes a little bit of work though right now. But my argument would be that work is worthwhile, and more libertarian-minded people and free speech-minded people should be looking at Bitcoin and trying to learn about Bitcoin and trying to use it.
Yes, because we've been covering at the Unshackled the banking and financial deplatforming. Obviously, it began with Patreon and PayPal deplatforming content creators who had the wrong opinions, and then it went to PayPal. And one of the things we've covered recently is a lot of Australian Patriot activists having their commercial bank accounts with ANZ and Westpac shut down, and the bank says, oh, we have the power to shut it down, but we're not going to tell you why. Shift your money. We don't want to do business with you again. And of course, everyone engages with financial transactions or just any type of exchange. If you want to bring it back to that basic Austrian economics, people exchange. Obviously, it began with the barter days direct exchange, then indirect exchange, and that's when money was developed as a medium of exchange. And so we exchange goods and other forms of money every day. And I think some people, if they swipe their card at the supermarket and it's declined not because there's no money in there, but apparently because they're wrong think. It's obviously, if that happened to you 30 years ago, there's not much else you could do. And of course, these days, I'm not sure if you've been following the cash ban, $10,000 or more. It's going to be illegal to carry that in cash. So they're cracking down on. Well, who would have thought the state would further regulate how you're allowed to use their currency?
Yeah, I mean, you make a lot of good points already. Fundamentally, we are seeing creeping controls, further KYC, further AML, sanctions laws, as you mentioned, currency, capital controls, use of things like a ban on transactions above $10,000, etc. And the reality of it is that, as any of your listeners who have read Huntsman and Hopper would know, that the more things that are controlled by politics, the more things just become like a political football, right? And so it's a natural creeping phenomenon where more and more things become politically determined, where maybe when you and I were kids, people could go to the football and it wouldn't necessarily be so politicized, right? But nowadays, everything is politicized. Well, now your money is getting politicized even further. And so that is an angle, and as I'm sure your listeners are aware, that can be used as a vector to try and shut people down. And sometimes it can be in a chilling effect sense as well, because right now banks and other financial companies and financial services companies, they live in fear of losing their banking license, because if they lose their banking license, it's game over. And so typically then what happens is the government and the regulators basically deputize banks and other companies to do their bidding for them, to say, hey, we want you to do X, Y, and Z AML controls. We want you to do X, Y, and Z screening of transactions. And then it starts to become this effect where banks sometimes aren't clear where they're allowed to play. And so then they err on the safe side because they don't want to lose their license. So then that's where they start doing this deplatforming aspect of it. And that's where, say, Visa and MasterCard will then try and start applying pressure to people who are using Visa and MasterCard as a payment rail. And so then that's where some of this stuff happens, where, say, Gab has had problems with, many problems with taking payments online and other industries as well. So whether that's drug industries or sometimes sex workers, other, for whatever reasons, and sometimes industries that are perfectly legal, or even industries that are maybe in a more gray zone, depending on what country you're talking about.
Well, victimless crime industries, I think that's the best way to refer to them.
Yeah, exactly. So any of these victimless crime industries, they've often had issues, even if they are legal, to still get banking relationships and banking going. And so then they're stuck trying to deal with all these different payment processes, and some of them are a bit more on the dodgy side. Some of them will charge very high fees. Some of them will revoke the money. There'll be chargebacks. There's all these other little components to it, and it's not so easy to just say, "Oh, use this other payment thing." So, but then that is where Bitcoin comes in. And so now with Bitcoin, people can use open source software such as BTC Pay Server, and they can then use that to basically set up and take payment in a way that's unstoppable. Nobody can stop that payment. And so that is an incredibly powerful thing.
I'll stop you there. What is open source? Because it's got into everyday language now. For example, Signal, which is one of the encrypted messaging servers, that's described as open source. What does it actually mean? Because this is the aim of tonight, to sort of break down the jargon and have it explained.
Great question. So open source refers to typically the code being open source, right? That's the key thing. The software of that is available for anyone to review. They can just look it up online, and typically that might be hosted on a website such as github.com or it could be hosted somewhere else. And I guess the important thing to understand is it's not just that literal the code being open source, it's a certain ethos, right? So when there are open source projects, and you would be surprised to so some of your listeners might not be as technical, let's say, but amongst computer programmers, there are some of them who will work their day job at a normal, full-time computer programming, software development, or computer science job, but then at home, they'll go home and code for free. Why is that? Now, the answer to that is that they enjoy contributing to some of these different projects, because some of these different open source projects are really a passion project for them. Sometimes it's scratching your own itch. Sometimes they wanted their own calculator software, or they wanted their own software to download podcasts with, or whatever it is, or software to interact with Bitcoin. And so that is part of there's a certain ethos around open source and about contributing into that software. And then so with open source, one of the things that happens is it allows for the development of that code to be out in the open. And it allows for, in some ways, more security by having more eyes on that code. It means more people can now look at that code. Now, yes, the downside is you need to have enough technical people who are looking at the code to give it that security, but that is one of the benefits. And so what you'll see is that sometimes proprietary closed source software that is, you can't read that code, it won't be as easy to build on top of. Whereas open source software, like, people can just sort of take these different components, and they're sort of modular, if you will. You can throw them together in some ways. And then that's one component that's been really powerful with Bitcoin. So I guess to sort of bring it back to Bitcoin being open source, it's that so fundamentally, the code of Bitcoin is open source. All the development happens out in the open. So there's an open mailing list with thousands of people on it, and they will contribute ideas to that mailing list. They will say, oh, what if we developed this feature or that feature? But then it might be debated from a technical point of view. Someone else might say, no, I disagree. We can't have that because that opens up a security vulnerability this way, that way, etc. And then the way it works is then that people will debate certain proposals, and they may happen in different forums such as IRC, Internet Relay Chat, the mailing list, as I mentioned, or directly on GitHub. They may put comments on things. They may say, hey, what if we made a change to the code known as a pull request? What if I made a pull request to try and change that code to make it do this? Maybe I want to add a new feature, or I want to try and change it to maybe, oh, I spotted a bug, and here's a way to remove the bug from that code, or something's malicious, we need to fix that. So that's kind of in a high level what it does. But I think the more important point is to understand that ethos around open source, and that it's less about having an expectation of someone else doing things for you, but more just doing things for the benefit of the community. And I know that sounds sort of socialist or whatever, but it's not. Like, you can still be very capitalist about it, right?
Well, it's voluntary, as we like to say. Even though you're contributing something for free, there's often the expression "pay it forward," which pay it forward, you're not forced to pay it forward. It's an ethos, but I don't think it doesn't sound socialist to me at all. It sounds like, because this is the thing, that Bitcoin, even though it was created through the so-called anarchy of the internet, there's so much order and security around it. As the expression goes, it's a beautiful anarchy.
Yeah, right. I think that's Jeffrey Tucker, right? But
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
so yeah, I think it. Yeah, so there's a few things here to understand. So there's a few different layers at play here, right? So the code that Satoshi Nakamoto wrote back in 2008 and 2009, or when Satoshi published it, what's happened is the community took that on, and they've continued developing and adding new features on top of new features on top of new features, such that they have added more features to the system, and also they've helped it scale to a certain level, and they have helped keep the system secure. But understand that there's different layers here. So think of it like the same way that you've got a computer and you might be running Windows or Mac or Linux. That would be considered the operating system. But then on top of that, you can run different software, right? So in the same way, Bitcoin, the underlying software, you can think of that like there's what we call consensus, the protocol at a protocol level. And then there are other things like applications that interact with that protocol. So for example, if you have a Bitcoin wallet, and then that wallet, think of it this way, it knows how to interact with the Bitcoin protocol to tell you, oh, Tim, this is what your balance is. Or Tim, you would like to send zero point 0.1 Bitcoin to someone else. That wallet helps you interact with the protocol in a way that makes it easy for you, rather than you having to do everything on the command line yourself, if that makes sense. And that allows you to do other features, such as using a hardware wallet. So any of your listeners who have Bitcoin, they might have, say, a Trezor or a Ledger, let's say, which are some common hardware wallets which help you secure your Bitcoins.
Where would, because I've heard obviously Bitcoin wallet that stores your Bitcoin, but how do you exactly get your hands on a wallet? Like, can you Google Bitcoin wallet and it'll give you like reliable ones? Because I've also heard stories about people's Bitcoin wallets disappearing. Not so much these days, but that was a bug, if you want to call it, a number of years ago.
Yeah, so definitely there have been a lot of unscrupulous actors in the space who have used malicious software or tried to basically trick you into using some other cryptocurrency, which they fallaciously, or in a tricking way, they tried to call it Bitcoin when really it was not Bitcoin. So if your listeners are interested, some wallets that I would just name, Samurai Wallet is a good one for Android. Blockstream Green is a good one for iPhone or Android if you just want a typical Bitcoin wallet. Otherwise, there are some other ones. Dropbit, that's another one. Zap is another one. So yeah, they're just a few off the top of my head. And Electrum would be a good one for a desktop. But just note, Electrum is a little bit more of a power user wallet. Yeah, so I guess there are a few just off the top of my head. But the key point to understand there is that it's very difficult in some ways to find high quality information in the space, because there were a lot of people who basically had some alternative currency to shill to you, or some questionable project to shill to people, rather than trying to provide good, honest information.
Yeah, and obviously, I hope that that's sort of like how there's, because obviously when I started the Unshackled, I used WordPress, which is a open source online content management system, and all these websites popped up over the years to give advice on that. So obviously you've named a few there. Is that something Ministry of Nodes is like doing, sort of lists of who are the top 10 of Bitcoin wallets or other parts of the industry?
So as part of our articles and so on, and we also have a YouTube channel where we have done some reviews of hardware wallets, for example. So Ledger, Trezor, Coldcard as well. So Coldcard is currently my favorite in terms of hardware wallets. But yeah, so we are planning to do some articles around that as well. And our main offering at the moment is the webinar, basically. So we understand that most people are busy. They don't have time to deal with these things, and it takes literally hundreds, if not thousands of hours to try and pull this together. So what we're trying to do is basically pull it together into a way that's very easily digestible for people who've got jobs and families and hobbies and lives outside of Bitcoin. Let us help you with that, and we'll kind of coach you through and speed you through that learning curve.
And obviously, another bit of jargon that's talked about is blockchain. So can you give a beginner's introduction to what it is and what are the benefits of it?
Okay, so this is a very, again, can be controversial. Now, there are some, so you might have, this narrative came in a couple of years ago. It was like blockchain, not Bitcoin, right? So there was these people who were trying to talk about blockchain technology as though it was some amazing, incredible general purpose technology. The short answer is no, it's not. Now, let me just wind back a second and just give a rough high level of what blockchain is, right? So some people very simplistically will say, hey, it's just a chain of blocks, right? But the key point to understand with Bitcoin, and again, this gets, I don't want to go too into the detail around the cryptography and so on, but the basic idea is that so Bitcoin is a network that has to maintain consensus in a distributed way without having any centralized party say, yes, this is the canonical block. Yes, this is the canonical update. So what it does is it uses cryptography in such a way that it's hard to basically bluff, if that makes sense. You can check it very quickly, but it's hard to go reverse, if that makes sense. And so because of that, what it does is every block includes what's known as the hash of the prior block inside it. And then that is where this whole idea of the blockchain creating a canonical ordering or a correct ordering of the transactions and updates to the ledger of blockchain, right? So if you used to, like in accounting, the T ledger, so the idea of, okay, there's transactions going back and forward. The blockchain is a record of all those transactions. And it's done in such a way, the point is to make it immutable, right? Now, I'll bring in a point from one of the well-known scholars and philosophers and cryptographers and computer scientists in the space. His name is Nick Szabo, and he's in fact quoted in the Bitcoin white paper. Now, he wrote a great blog post a little while ago called Money, Blockchains, and Social Scalability. And so the point he was trying to make in that article was essentially that blockchains were not chosen for their computational efficiency. They were something that helped humanity scale beyond the Dunbar number. What's the Dunbar number? It's about 150 people. It's sort of like it's like this idea of this is the number of relationships you can hold in your head at a reasonable level. If you go too far above that, they become weaker and weaker connections. And so above that, it becomes more difficult to scale a society, right? And this is like ideas of high trust, low trust, etc. But the fundamental idea is that any time in history that somebody has had control of the money, they have had that tendency to want to print, right? Because it's a massively beneficial power. And so what Bitcoin does is you can think of it like it's like the Lord of the We're taking that ring and we're throwing it in the fire. We're saying we're taking that ring outside the control of any one person, and we're encoding it into these rules that have certain rules saying there will never be more than 21 million Bitcoins, etc. So what, in that sense, blockchain was really more like a special purpose piece of technology that was used in Bitcoin in that way to help achieve this social scalability aspect. It's not useful in other contexts. And so what your listeners may have seen is various different projects and other non-Bitcoin uses of blockchain, which basically have none of them that I've seen have turned out to actually be profitable use cases of a blockchain. For the most part, it's just a lot of basically either charlatans or misguided people.
So it's like a record keeping interface or software. What would you actually define it as in terms of its functionality? Like, sort of what group does it belong to?
Well, I guess one way to think of it is like an append-only database, right? It means it's like a database that you can only add to, right? If you can sort of think of it like that, that is probably a bit clearer way to think about it. But then when you think about it from that point of view, there's this whole group of people who are like, oh, blockchain technology, it's like an amazing general purpose technology or whatever, that we're still discovering the use cases for it, blah, blah, blah. But the reality, the harsh reality of it is that basically those things could be achieved through, in more efficient ways, through other technological means.
So are you saying that there's potentially security risk with blockchain, given that it is a database that could at some point be hacked and sensitive information could get out?
There may be, yeah, there may be. I mean, there's this whole some of these like misguided people who think, oh yeah, let's have voting on the blockchain or let's have healthcare data on the blockchain. No, like it just is not a good idea. And so fundamentally, there are other ways to achieve some of those other ideas technologically without using a blockchain, and they'd be more efficient and better suited to that purpose. So I think that's probably the key thing to understand on that point, that really you've got to think of it more as Bitcoin, not blockchain. That's how I would explain it.
Yeah. So I take it that you're not a fan, but obviously there is it has quite a glitzy reputation. For example, DLive, which is a live streaming website, they promoted it. We're a streaming and video hosting service on the blockchain, as if that's like a really good thing.
So let me explain a little bit around that. So let me articulate a little bit more about why blockchains are so computationally expensive. So there's probably three main things to think about with blockchain, right? So you've got the hard drive space, you've got the CPU power, like the processing of it, and the networking component of it. And so what Bitcoin does is, if you are running a Bitcoin full node software, it means every full node has to maintain a full copy of the entire ledger of Bitcoin's history, the blockchain, like the Bitcoin's blockchain, right? And so then that really starts to make you think, is that really an efficient data structure to use in other cases? And with Bitcoin, we have to understand the reason why it was chosen. It was chosen in such a way that it would be government resistant, or another way to put that is censorship resistant, right? So the only reason it is set up that way is because it needs to be censorship resistant. And it's just so unlikely to me, or almost infinitesimally small possibility, that any other case other than money really makes sense for using a blockchain in this way. Now, there are certain other ideas around anchoring certain aspects of trust to Bitcoin's blockchain, but it still remains to be seen whether they are profitable and so on. I think there may be some of them that will anchor to Bitcoin's blockchain in a certain way that it actually might make sense. But some of these other blockchain technology, put voting on the blockchain, whatever cases, no, I think they're just completely ignorant cases. So that's how I would try to simplify it down.
Yep. Yeah, well, definitely. We're about halfway through now. You've enlightened me a bit, so I think we're making good progress on the show. Now, obviously, as I said in the introduction, that Bitcoin is a protector against inflation, but new Bitcoins are put into circulation, or it's called Bitcoin mining. Obviously, what is Bitcoin mining? Who gets access to these new Bitcoins? Because we know in the central banking system, it's the licensed banks, i.e. privileged banks, that get all the funds first.
Yeah, great question. So with Bitcoin, because remember, this is a decentralized network that has to achieve distributed consensus. What that means is we all have to kind of agree on what is the true ledger. And because there's no CEO of Bitcoin, there's no central server of Bitcoin, how do you do that? Now, one of the important innovations or ideas that Satoshi sort of melded together was this idea of proof of work. Now, that means all of these miners around the world have to basically perform a certain amount of work. And when I say work, and it's kind of incorrectly described when you see them say it on the media, they say, oh, it's complex equations that the Bitcoin miners are doing. It's not necessarily complex equation. It's more like what they're doing is called a SHA-256 hash function, right? That is the function that they're applying. But what it's been done, it's been sort of set in such a way that they have to basically brute force many SHA-256 hashes. And what are they hashing? They're hashing the transaction data in that block to try and get it under a target value known as the nonce, a number used only once. Anyway, some of that is more technical speak, but the short kind of version, or the easy way to think of that, is Bitcoin miners perform work done where we verify the work that they're using cryptography to verify that, yes, this amount of work was done. And by this lottery system, the winner of that system gets to mint the new block, which gets added to the blockchain. Now, the broader point that you were mentioning around the supply of Bitcoin. So remember, the total number of Bitcoins there will ever be is less than 21. It's just under 21 million, basically. And that will be reached in the year 2140. Now, in terms of the schedule, so imagine 2140 is like the asymptote, and then the supply is kind of, it's like an asymptote curve that's like approaching that. And so you can think of it like, every 10 minutes on average, a new block is found, and inside that block is contained the new block Bitcoins that are awarded to the miner for successfully completing those SHA-256 hashing I was mentioning earlier. Now, Bitcoin has this thing coded into it known as a halving. So that means every 4 years, the amount of new Bitcoins being mined halves. So in the early days, it was being mined at 50 Bitcoins per new block. So that was known as the block subsidy. Then after the halving, it was 25. Next halving, 12.5. So we are currently in the 12.5 era. And then in roughly April, May next year, we'll be moving to the 6.25 Bitcoins per block era. And then every 4 years, it'll halve. And such that, the total in the year 2140 will be a little bit under 21 million. So currently, we've got about 18 million of those Bitcoins that have been issued into existence. And so basically, think of it this way. The miners have an incentive to help protect the network, and that in turn helps make it so that somebody else who wants to mess with the ledger by trying to rewrite history, it makes it harder for them to do that, because they would have to compete in terms of that SHA-256 or hashing process I mentioned earlier. So the reward that miners get is two components. It is the block subsidy, right? That part that you get every block. And then there's also transaction fees that if you transact on the Bitcoin network directly, you pay the miner some fee to have your transaction included into a block. Because remember, your transaction doesn't count until it's included in a block. And not just that, what people typically want is they want their transaction to be included in a block, and then the future history to get built on top of that blockchain, if you will. And so think of it, the best analogy I've heard on this is like amber. It's like the more the more amber that builds up around it, the more deeply ensconced or deeply encoded it is, if you will. Because if you do a transaction on the Bitcoin network and don't wait for those confirmations, there is a risk that that block is switched out for some other block before before you are able to rely on it. So that's why people say when you're doing a larger transaction in Bitcoin, one of the old school rules of thumb was to wait for 6 confirmations or 6 blocks to be mined on the Bitcoin network. Now, look, in fairness, some of this stuff it's getting to a technical level that most users don't really even need to get to eventually, because most in the future that we see, most users won't directly interact with Bitcoin's blockchain. Or if they do, their wallet software will handle it all in the background for you. I'm just trying to help you explain a little bit of what's happening under the hood, right? So in reality, most people will be transacting using things like Lightning Network, which is a new technology, think of it like it's using Bitcoin, but in a way that allows you to make transactions that are always able to be settled down to that base layer of Bitcoin, if you will. And then the other part is we may see retail banks that build up on top of Bitcoin. And then let's say you're with a certain Bitcoin bank and I'm using another Bitcoin bank. You and I can transact on top of that layer without necessarily transacting on the base layer of Bitcoin, because our banks are the ones settling to each other at the end of the day. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like I said, you've done a good job of explaining things. And yes, obviously, like you've said, this is very technical, but obviously there's a lot of, you talked about how the mainstream media tries to or how they want to explain it. And this is the thing, there's a lot of fake news about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency because, of course, there's the media political complex. It's one of the names that it's given, is that the media, they don't like things that are outside the state, and obviously they've attacked Bitcoin, for example. We were talking about it before, facilitating black market or illegal trades. Obviously I'm not sure if they were accepting Bitcoin, but Silk Road was the online, you could buy a lot of illicit drugs there, and the founder of that is serving something like life sentence plus 200 years, something like that.
Yeah, they basically tried to make an example of him, right? A lot of other people involved with Silk Road didn't get anywhere near that sentence. He was a first-time offender. They used a lot of dodgy tricks to basically make his case look much worse than it really was, and they made it. They used they tried to say that essentially he put out an assassination hit or order on people when that was never true, and then later that never really got walked back in court. So there was a lot of dodgy tricks happening around that. Fundamentally, though, I just want to make sure it's characterized correctly for your listeners as well. So we can think of Bitcoin not just as this incredible, payments technology, but let's also think of it as a savings technology, because now people can save their wealth, and using a Bitcoin full node, which can be run very cheaply using, say, software or hardware and stuff that costs like $200, you can verify the full Bitcoin blockchain and you can be your own bank. And that means people can now start stacking sats, as we say, meaning the smallest component of a Bitcoin is a Satoshi. So there's 100 million Satoshis in one Bitcoin. And so one way we talk of it is we stack sats. We're trying to accumulate territory in what we think is the scarcest asset that we think that known to man, and the first time we've ever seen true digital scarcity. And so I think if we think of it as a savings technology as well, that's another important piece of the puzzle to remember here with Bitcoin, that you can now start stacking sats and nobody can stop you doing that. And if you use the correct security techniques around your Bitcoin, such as multi-signature and so on, and other techniques, you can back it up, and you can do all these different things, and in such a way that it's just very difficult for anybody to stop you transacting and being a part of that Bitcoin economy. And so that's why I spend a lot of my time trying to teach people how, if they want to be part of the Bitcoin economy and you can take financial control back into your own hands by running your own full node and holding your own private keys of your Bitcoin, then that is how you can become a full-fledged Bitcoin user, if you will.
And obviously there's been a lot of attention to these so-called Bitcoin billionaires, and obviously the implication of that is that it's unearned wealth. They made it through speculation, and that Bitcoin trading, it's no different from being a stockbroker, where you're basically it's a form of gambling on, stockbroking is obviously on financial markets, but this is just obviously an internet version of that. And there's been a lot of talk about the Bitcoin bubble. There have been a few crashes, but then it still it keeps going up. But what's your interpretation of, obviously, the speculation in anything is, well, it's not the most economically productive activity. So sort of how do you respond to that there's sort of this unofficial trading market, which it's not fulfilling what a Bitcoin was originally meant to do, which is just facilitate peer-to-peer private transactions?
Right. So I think of it a little bit differently. I think, yeah, obviously the peer-to-peer private transactions is obviously a big part of it, but also Satoshi himself also wrote this idea, imagine a metal that was, easy to transport around the world. And there was a lot of gold analogies and so on used in some of those early forum posts and emails. Now, Satoshi's now gone. We don't know who he is or who he or they are. But I think that kind of digital gold idea was also there as well. Now, the challenging part, and I totally accept your point that there have been big kind of cycles up and down over Bitcoin's history, but every time it's come back. And so people who have held for at least 3 or 4 years have pretty much always done well out of it. And I think there's a reason for that. So one, some of the more fiat economists, the Keynesians of the world, will come out and say, oh, Bitcoin will never, it's too volatile, it'll never be used as a medium of exchange, blah, blah, blah. But I think they're ignoring that central banks exist to try and so-called stabilize the money, right? That's why central banks, like, part of their mandate is often, it depends which central bank you're talking about, right? But they've got things like mandate of employment and inflation and stability of the economy or whatever. But Bitcoin has no central bank. So of course, the only way this thing can get reflected is in the price. And if we believe this thing is the hardest, soundest, best money, most saleable money, then it's on this pathway. It's a long pathway. We think of it as a multi-decade pathway for adoption. And what happens is that people come to it in waves. So the first few people who came to it were the cypherpunks, right? The people who were privacy and cryptography advocates. Then the next wave was libertarians, right? And then the next wave was payments people, and then and so on and so forth. Each wave, if you will, it pulls in around a new round of people, and then some of those people actually dig in and understand what is going on with Bitcoin, and then they become the new base of hodlers, right? In the Bitcoin terminology, hodlers of last resort, and then eventually, typically we see the next halving, and then that pulls another round of people in, and each time and because we're fundamentally herd animals in some ways, right? We chase the herd. It's like momentum chasing, right? So people start seeing the run go up, and then what does that do? It triggers off these big runs up and then obviously down. But on the whole, over the long term, those people who just stack sats and just regularly accumulate small pieces of Bitcoin, they've done very well out of this. And the underlying thesis that we have is that we're seeing real-time monetization of a new asset that's programmatically harder than anything else. And if you think about it in that way, its inflation rate will drop even below that of gold. Or put in other words, the stock to flow ratio of it will go higher than anything else known to man. And now we haven't got there yet, but it's going to get there. So let me back up and explain that stock to flow part. So stock is the existing amount of supply of something. The flow is the incoming amount per year. So for example, let's say, quick example, the world had 100 tons of gold. Then the annual supply of new gold mined that year is 1.5 tons. So, right? And so that's about what gold's mining rate is these days. It's around 1.5 to 2%. That's its inflation rate, if you will, or one over that obviously will give you the stock to flow ratio of gold. So if you try and crunch those numbers out for Bitcoin, that will show over the longer term, because of these halvings that we explained earlier, that Bitcoin's stock to flow will go higher, basically into uncharted waters. It'll go into a place that humanity has never seen before. And this is actually something really phenomenal and has never been achieved before. So many of us believe that this is part of what drives Bitcoin's rise to becoming someday the global money of the world.
I know that Ron Paul, who he pretty much reinvigorated libertarianism and the movement worldwide, he's still a gold bug. He's still very, because it is a digital. You described it as a digital gold, but it's still digital, and so obviously Ron Paul still sees gold, because it is a precious metal where you cannot just create more gold out of thin air. He still backs investing in gold and other precious metals for complete 100% confidence against inflation.
Great point. Now, I would say depends on the view here. Some Bitcoiners are they think gold is gone. Other people see a role for gold and Bitcoin. Now, the quick point I would want to make to your listeners here is gold is politically vulnerable. It just fundamentally is vulnerable, and what happens historically is that it tends to get stored in vaults. Those vaults get centralized, and then the government can just go and co-opt the gold in those
Which
vaults.
they have.
And that's historically, unfortunately, yeah. So that is fundamentally the technological problem, and that in that sense, that's why Bitcoin is a game changer. Because, as I mentioned, for about maybe $200 you can run a Bitcoin full node, and maybe for another $100 or $200 you can get a couple of hardware wallets, and you can start running multi-signature as well. So maybe total cost, let's call it $600, $700. You can start storing incredible amounts of wealth on that setup, and distribute the keys for that setup. You could keep one key in a safe somewhere, one key in a deposit box, one key in another country, even one key with your family, and then if somebody tries to steal that Bitcoin from you, if you're using multi-signature technology, just because they've stolen one key from you, they can't take it from you, because you've distributed the control for that Bitcoin around the world. You can't do that with gold. And then the other thing to think about is that gold can't be sent anywhere around the world for a fraction of the cost, right? Because gold requires, you've got to have guards, you've got to do all this stuff, and then it requires the political will and the political permission to exist in that way and be used as money, where with Bitcoin, it doesn't matter. You can just spend it anywhere and no one can really stop you. So that is where I would say fundamentally Bitcoin is a game changer, in that, put it this way, it helps stop counterfeiting, because your Bitcoin full node, as I mentioned, that software and that little hardware stack that you can set up, you can run that very cheaply, and you can think of that like a fake Bitcoin detector, right? So right now, if somebody tried to give you fake gold, how would you know, right? You would weigh it. Maybe you would use that thing that tries to detect if there's tungsten inside it and
Yes.
gold on the outside, right? Like those things like that. But now with Bitcoin full node software, you can verify it very cheaply. And with Bitcoin technology, you can secure it much more cheaply, and then you can send it anywhere around the world much more cheaply. So in that sense, that's why it's technologically a game changer. It's just taking time for people to appreciate this and understand this, because right now, the number of people who understood just what I just explained to you right now is very minuscule. It's tiny. It's like a rounding error in terms of the global population. We believe that as more people start to understand that, we'll see big upward movements in the price of Bitcoin and the adoption overall of Bitcoin. But one other caution I would say to your listeners is to think of it like, so remember, coming back to that idea of savings technology, not just payments technology, we think of it like most people are stacking sats so they can hodl, right? Because they believe this thing is going to be worth, pick a number, 10 million per Bitcoin, 15 million per Bitcoin, it could be more than that. So from that point of view, they would rather just save in this, and they would rather spend in their Australian dollar or other fiat money. So that is fundamentally the way most kind of hardcore Bitcoiners are thinking about it.
As you said before, nobody can stop you holding Bitcoin or engaging in Bitcoin trades, which is one of the reasons I've got you on tonight, because it's free speech money. Obviously, there is a bit of a corporatization of, well, not Bitcoin, but the whole cryptocurrency industry. There's obviously digital currency exchanges now which have deplatformed people for wrong things, such as Coinbase. But in terms of the peer-to-peer, you can never, because it is one person to another, that can never be shut down. And obviously, because I mentioned before, Patreon on paper, which was a popular source of crowdfunding for independent content creators. I know that there is now a cryptocurrency crowdfunding website, Bitbacker, which was being promoted by another Australian libertarian, Naomi Brockwell. So a lot of Australians are doing quite well in the international, I would say, Austro-libertarian community, which obviously I call this because the old thing is, with people getting their bank accounts shut down and that, obviously there's a lot of people that don't care about that, and obviously social media deplatforming, the response is, well, if you don't like it, start your own social media or bank or whatever, which used to be very hard, but now it's relatively easy because the internet is always one step ahead. I call this blackjack and hooker economics. You know, the meme. Well, I'll just create my own. You pretty much can. Andrew Torba he's been deplatformed every step of the way. He's basically created his own blackjack and hooker, like everything, like ISP server, own payment processing, everything. And the Proud Boys, I'm not sure how much you know about them, but they've been deplatformed. They're pretty much creating their own of everything. And obviously the government would like, they say the internet's unregulated, but most of the time that's a good thing because the startup costs are so low. And this is why all of this is so liberating. And well, Bitcoin was invented 10 years ago, even before this deplatforming was even thought could happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So Andrew Torba at Gab has used BTC Pay Server as well, which is a great Bitcoin project. And I would definitely encourage your listeners who are interested in, if they want to do their own projects and things, look into BTC Pay Server. It's an open source.
This is the one that you sent me the graphic. And I noticed that it has,
exactly it.
The thing that attracted me was WordPress integration, which obviously it's open source content management system, works with WooCommerce. So if you're able to master those content management systems, BTCP is not too much of a leap.
Yeah, exactly. And so I would say, it looks maybe the image is a little bit blurry, but yeah. Anyway, like if you Google BTC Pay Server. I've actually done an interview series on my podcast as well with the team from BTC Pay, so listeners can check that out as well. But the key things to understand is that BTC Pay Server, you can think of it like if Bitcoin is being your own bank, BTC Pay Server is like being your own payment processor. And so what it is, think of it like a technology stack, and it automatically installs a bunch of these different things. It has integrations like WooCommerce integration and WordPress and so on, and it can then integrate and hook in with your website, and basically whatever the amount that somebody wants to pay in fiat, so let's say $10 Australian, right? That's the cost of the product, or say you're selling a book on your website, and then once you've set up BTC Pay Server, it will send your customer, it'll give your customer that option, and you can send them it'll basically spit up a page, and it'll say, hey, here's $10 AUD, but in Bitcoin, right? Translated at the exchange rate. It'll give them an address, a Bitcoin address to pay to. And then once they've paid it, they scan it and pay it with their Bitcoin wallet, then it'll shut that and take them back to your site. And then off you go, right? Now you're being your own payment processor. And what you can do is you can use some of the different setups that BTC Pay have got for you. So it's very easy. So you can pretty much get set up in, I would say, 10 to 15 minutes worth of time. Basically, once you know what you're doing. And they've got this thing called like a one-click deploy on Lunar Node, which basically sets up a VPS, virtual private server. So again, I don't want to get too technical for the listeners, otherwise it just gets a bit too difficult. But the basic idea is you would basically set up this VPS, which is kind of like your own hosted BTC Pay, and you would configure it with certain things like about your Bitcoin wallet, like you would put in your extended public keys, and then BTC Pay will then use that to generate addresses for you, right? So some of your listeners might have been accustomed to just using, say, a standard donation address for things, but with BTC Pay Server, you can actually generate a new address and deal with it more in a systematic way rather than using one single address for things. And using one single address for things is actually really a bad practice from a privacy point of view as well. So that's why I would really recommend listeners look into this project. It's well worthwhile, and a lot of people are using it to really free themselves from the controls of government money. And it's really liberating once you have one to take payment on one as well. So that's something you can look into, and it really is a great answer to the problems that we are facing with fiat money, AML, sanctions, and all of these other controls and capital controls we're seeing.
And I mentioned the cryptocurrency exchanges. They charge transaction fees, which any type of fee which basically everyone thinks of it as just being siphoned off to somebody who hasn't earned it. Obviously, BTC Pay zero transaction fees. Somebody just asked, was that a paid advertisement?
No, it's literally, I don't get paid for that. It's like literally, it's an open source, again, as I mentioned, it's an open source project. It's I shill it for free because I use it myself and because I believe in it. Yeah, I definitely recommend it. And so the thing is, there are different levels and models you can use within Bitcoin. There are some known as custodial model, right? Like, so an exchange, for example, is a custodial, right, account for you. But with BTC Pay Server and with using some of these other pieces of software, you can actually hold it yourself. You can self-custody your Bitcoin. And that is really the proper decentralized vision of Bitcoin, that you hold your own Bitcoin using your own software and your own private keys.
Now, I've got my next guest who's currently waiting, so I've got one more important question. Obviously, your area of expertise, you focus solely on Bitcoin, but there's a whole lot of other cryptocurrencies that have emerged as well. There's a whole other universe there, and sort of each political grouping has now got its own cryptocurrency. For example, Monero, that's the one for the alt-right, and even Facebook, they're seeing the benefit of cryptocurrency with their proposing Libra. Good luck convincing any of us to use that. But are they all the same, or do some of them have like holes in them, whether in terms of security or inflation?
Yeah, great question. And fundamentally, Bitcoin is exceptional. It's the only one that's actually properly decentralized, and that's what matters in the long term. So this may sound very like, oh, I'm toxic or closed-minded or whatever, and that's what typically some of these altcoin shills will throw at the more ardent or strident Bitcoin proponents. But essentially, none of these altcoins has the same qualities around it. It doesn't have the same level of developers, doesn't have the same level of infrastructure, doesn't have the same network effects, doesn't have the same level of buy support. If you look on an exchange, the liquidity for the altcoins is nowhere near that of Bitcoin. And so if you look at how much slippage you would incur by trying to do a big buy or a big sell of some of these altcoins, you would move the market far more than if you tried with Bitcoin. And there's a reason for that. It's because many of these people have seen, hey, wouldn't it be cool to mint my own money? And so no one has really been able to topple Bitcoin because they weren't able to understand what made Bitcoin so valuable in the first place, which was actually being truly decentralized and not having a CEO, not having a benevolent founder, not having a foundation that is a controlling foundation that can basically influence the direction of that altcoin and direct it to do a hard fork every 6 months, for example. So they're just a few examples of why Bitcoin is exceptional and should be seen that way. And I think longer term, the truth will out, right? And you'll see that if you look back in history, there were many other altcoins, and many of them don't even exist now, or they're just irrelevant now because they're tiny as a percentage of the price of Bitcoin, or they're just insecure. So yeah, I guess that's all I can say in a very short answer, but I can go into further detail, and I do on the podcast as well, around why Bitcoin is exceptional.
Yeah, oh, I think the explanation that you gave there was quite convincing. Obviously, and of course, Bitcoin was the original, so sort of imitations. A lot of the time, you can't beat the original. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed our discussion. It was incredibly informative, and I hope our audience found it as well. No wonder you're one of the world's best. If people want to listen to, well, more hours and hours, because that's, as you said, you could go into go into hours and hours discussion about Bitcoin and the various aspects of it. So if people want to know more, how can they connect with your podcast?
Well, thank you. Yeah, so it's stephanlivera.com and Twitter at Stephan Livera. So you can find my podcast by searching Stephan Livera podcast on the apps. But basically, you can find everything if you go to stephanlivera.com. And thank you very much, Tim. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, and I'd love to have you on again if there's some sort of development in Bitcoin. In terms of the other cryptocurrencies, I might see if I can find an alternative, as you call it, shill for those other cryptocurrencies to see if they can make the case. But yeah, take care, or hopefully we can catch up maybe, because like I said, I only reconnected with you this week. Hopefully it won't be another sort of 3 years or so before we catch up again.
For sure.
All right, have a good night.
Thank you.
Take care. And yeah, like I said, I meant what I said to him. That was, it was really informative for me. Stefani broke it down incredibly well. I told him in the preparation that it was back to basics. And yeah, so I definitely am much more informed now, and I hope you are as well. Now, as you can see, if you're watching, you can see that I've got Lucas Rose's picture there, because if you've been following the news in Australia this week, you will know that there has been the IMARC blockade outside IMARC stands for International Mining and Resources Conference, which is obviously, as the name suggests, here's Lucas. Hello, Lucas.
G'day, Tim. How you going?
Yeah, good, thanks. Having a bit of trouble hearing you at the moment. I'm not sure if you can hold the phone closer to you. But this is actually the first time we've had you on a live, unshackled production, which is
yes, indeed.
As an experience on its own.
Might take a little bit of adjustment.
Which means that the live audience, they can interact with you. There was a slight glitch there for a moment where it said that 0 people were watching, and I was sort of like, what? They just all left after that?
Yep.
So let me know if you can hear Lucas well, because I know that the phone can be a bit grainy. I'll actually turn you up a bit, just on my end here.
Here we go. I'm adjusting on my end. How's that?
Yep. Yeah, it should be.
It should be
good. Yep. My audience, they're actually not very. They're actually one of the least whiny online audiences. When I do Trans-Tasman talk with Due de Boer, the people in his live chat are like, this audio isn't right here, you didn't get this factually correct. They're really sort of hard to please, but yeah, my audience is pretty laid back.
Well, can't please everybody.
Exactly. And I'm still putting the entropy link in the YouTube live chat. So if you have a question or want to send through a super chat, you know where to go to. I didn't mention that I was speaking to you in the introduction to the show. Well, basically because it could have fallen through at the last minute, and I don't like to be that person which cancels something at the last minute. But I think it's a nice surprise, you coming on.
Good being here, Tim.
Now, obviously, you were writing about the IMARC conference months in advance, that the various socialists, Marxists and anarchist groups in Melbourne, one of the organisers said so themselves, that they wanted to be like the S11 riots in Melbourne in 2000, when there was a globalisation conference. Well, they did cause...
that previously.
They did cause...
when left-wingers were against globalisation.
Well, they did cause some mayhem this week, but in my opinion, it was no S11. I'm not sure. How did you see it?
Well, it was really interesting because I was inside their chat groups, and I'd managed to get inside some of their signal groups as well. And so you saw as the day approached, they started getting more and more worried, because when they first announced this back in August, they thought that with the Extinction Rebellion sort of protests going on and the general momentum from that they'd be getting somewhere between 1,000 and 5,000 people. And in the end, they didn't end up getting anywhere near that. They, at most, I think on one day, they got about 400 at the most, if that. And so it was, in terms of numbers, it was a severe disappointment for them.
The Monday when the conference began, it was pretty mediocre turnout, but the organisers said, "Oh, tomorrow's our big day," and of course they claim that the police just unprovoked attacked them with batons. But of course, you have the right in Australia and Victoria to lawfully protest, but you cannot block people's access to the roads, or at least that's what the law says, or block them from entering a private building or the exhibition and convention centre. You hire it out for private events. And obviously this mining conference, they had paid the exhibition and convention centre a fee to hold it there. It was a legal private event, and if you had a ticket there, then obviously you on the public publicly shared footpaths and roads, you had a legal right to go into that private event. And of course, when the protesters started blocking that, it seemed to me that the Victoria Police, they definitely were mad as hell and were not going to take it anymore, because there was just because they screamed and bitched and moaned, as they always do, that police brutality, these Marxists and socialists. But Victoria Police all throughout the week said the response was appropriate. We're happy with how our officers dealt with it. Even when was one of the Channel 7 reporters, he got moved on. Apparently that was a big outrage, because apparently he's supposed to have a journalism license. Victoria Police said no, he didn't follow. Jack Dowsley, I think was his name. I don't remember his name. Yes, and of course there was
Tim, they laid hands on a journalist. How dare they? Don't they understand that most of them don't even have a university degree? They laid hands on one of the chosen people. My God, how dare they? The reaction from journalists on Twitter, the reaction from journalists across online is just like, you rarely see them so angry as when somebody lays a finger on one of their chosen little club.
Oh yeah, the Fargo reporter there, that's the Melbourne University student Rag. Apparently, even though she's a student and apparently she's still got a journalism license, she got pepper sprayed. That was an outrage as well.
Yeah, I saw the pictures of her being pepper sprayed. I smiled at those. But the truth of the matter is like what you went over. There's a couple of different takes on this. The first is, of course, you are not allowed to stop people from going into a place. That's illegal. And you're not allowed to do that. It's against the law. This is something that needs to be said a couple of times, because apparently for most of the journalists in Australia, and of course for the socialists, they apparently don't think that's the case. But no, you're not allowed to block somebody else's building. You're allowed to protest any place you want, peacefully. You're allowed to even get very loud and noisy and boisterous of your protest. You're allowed to jump up and down and make up amusing chants. You're not allowed to block the entrances to a building, particularly when the main entrance they blocked was the disabled one with the wheelchair ramp. So Victoria Police were entirely within their rights to come in and try and move them out, and of course they failed to comply, which is failure to comply with police instructions. That's also an arrestable offence. It is a shame that most of the ones who were arrested, because there were quite a few very well-known far-left extremist names that were briefly arrested, like Jerome Small and Edward Plowman and people like that. But the police just did catch and release, unfortunately. They arrested them, had a chat to them, moved them away from the barricade and let them go so they could come back to the barricade again.
You've
But
been
the
naming
more-
and shaming these socialists and Marxists for years now, but I noticed you had to put it crudely, a bit of a what do you call it? Doxing orgasm when Andrew Bolton and Sky News, they started naming and shaming the organisers and prominent activists who were there.
Well, it's such an obvious thing. It is the biggest scandal in Australian journalism. It is the biggest scandal that has been in modern Australian journalistic history. It is the fact that nearly every major march, nearly every major protest that's on the left in Melbourne, there are exceptions, but nearly every major one, is organised by far-left extremists, revolutionary Marxists who want to overthrow the government and implement a totalitarian state. And Andrew Bolt actually came out and said that. He's the first. Look, he's mentioned Marxists before, but that's the first time he's actually come out and said, hey, wait a second, these people, they want to overthrow the government and bring back communism. I mean, and they're not even shy about it. I mean, people laugh, oh, communism. No, really. These are old-fashioned Marxists. They want to overthrow the government and implement a totalitarian socialist state. It's on them. That's what they genuinely believe. And they're, considering the small numbers that they actually got to this blockade, just looking at the photos and looking across my records, I reckon probably about a quarter to a third of the people who actually showed up were known active members of far-left extremist organisations. And that doesn't even count the ones that I don't know.
Well, one of the ones you've written about regularly was Jerome Small, who was one of the ones who, as you said, were caught and released. This is an image of him giving an interview to 3CR, which seems to be, well, 3CR seems to stand for Communist Radio, because they host so many far left programs, and of course that's why. No,
Tim, that's just not true. They also host anarchists.
Yeah.
And of course, they receive public funding through the community radio organisations and that sort of stuff.
Yes, of course they.
Although it has to be said that nearly everyone who broadcasts on them is a volunteer. They don't get paid, but their upkeep costs and the like, and their licence are all based off public funding.
So Jerome Small, please, for our audience, name and shame his associations.
Well, Jerome Small started back in the 1980s. That's how far back he's been involved in far-left extremist politics. He was in the ACT back then. He was involved with various far-left groups. By the early 90s, he was a member of the International Socialist Organisation, which is a Trotskyist group, which means that they want to have a communist revolution, but they want to stop the early Soviet Union and not go to the Stalinist version. So just the part where they were murdering people rather than murdering people with a fun mustache. Then in 1995, Mick Armstrong, Jeff Sparrow and a few others were thrown out of the International Socialist Organisation, and Jerome Small left in protest with them.
People will know that name, Jeff Sparrow. He's a Guardian columnist, or some people might call him a Guardian journalist.
Columnist. And with Jeff Sparrow, Jerome Small founded the Socialist Alternative, another revolutionary Trotskyist group which wants to overthrow the government. Jeff Sparrow has never apologised for creating what is now the largest violent extremist organisation in Australia. He's never announced his views, and even a couple of years ago he was speaking at Socialist Alternative conferences, and he was trying to promote the IMARC blockade himself on Twitter and on Facebook in the run-up to the event. So, yeah, that tells you everything you need to know about the Guardian Australia's political leanings and their attitude towards extremist associations. But Jerome Small, in the late 90s, he was involved in organising the attacks on Pauline Hanson meetings in Melbourne. Very violent, sometimes attacks that happened in Melbourne in the late 90s. In 2000, he was involved in the original S11, although this has only really been a pale sort of, a very pale repeat He was involved in that original one, which was the anti-globalisation protests around Crown Casino, which ended in mass violence, the Premier of Western Australia being trapped in his car by rioters and having to be rescued by police, mass violence, vandalism across the course of many days, which is what they were trying to recreate here with the IMAP protests. The next year he was arrested for the follow-ups to those protests, because this is how these things work. They mobilise a large amount of people for an event, like they have this time with the Extinction Rebellion stuff, and then they try and roll those people into future events. And that's what happened in the S11 protests was that, and they had what they called the M1 protests, May Day the next year in 2001. All these things have really been sort of forgotten in the aftermath of the September 11 attacks, but they all did happen, and they were all very important at the time. So he was arrested. He was arrested and fined outside the protest outside the Nike store in Melbourne. A little bit after that, he started getting involved in the refugee movement, and his house was raided in regards to creating false passports for refugees. He's been involved in all sorts of different protests since. He was one of the organisers of the anti-Reclaim Australia rallies. He was involved in the socialist alternative contingent for the East-West protests. He's been pretty much involved in almost everything. I mean, I believe he's a CFMEU member, and he was involved in trying to spruik gay marriage to the CFMEU as well. And, so his technical title is industrial organiser, because he's the one who's supposed to be coordinating those members of Socialist Alternative that are infiltrating the union movement. And he's done a couple of programs with that, although he hasn't had a huge amount of success.
Let's go to
the idea that someone who has been a member of extremist groups since the late 80s, has been actively trying to overthrow the Australian government since the late 80s, then comes out and organises another protest, and only Andrew Bolt actually names him for who he is. Only Andrew Bolt and me name him for who he is. And the fact that this guy genuinely, and a large percentage of the protesters there, were protesting against that mining conference because they want to overthrow the government. They want to create enough momentum with this campaign to cause enough civil disturbance to bring enough people into their fold so that they can convert them to hardline Marxist ideology, with an aim to eventually overthrowing the government in the future. No journalist bothers to look this up. And this is all publicly available information, not just publicly available because I've published it. It's publicly available everywhere. The idea that they couldn't find this out is insane.
The main organiser of this, she's from the next generation of Marxist revolutionary activists, is Emma Black.
Emma Black you're talking about?
Yes, and here she is. I'm showing photos of all
Black
of them here.
One of the main.
Oh, she wasn't?
This is the thing. I've got access. She was the main spokeswoman. I've got access to their minutes and some of their internal signal stuff. Most of the promotion and sort of propaganda stuff that was done by Jerome Small and Omar Hassan, who's another socialist alternative guy. He's the editor of Marxist Left Review, which is their theoretical magazine. And the money for all of the posters that got put up all around Melbourne, I think it was $1,500 or so, came directly from Jerome Small's pocket. He funded this, the organising for this protest. He coordinated with the unions because I think there was a health services union meeting on Monday at the exhibition centre as well that they had to work around. He did the coordination. He did all of that stuff. So it was all him in the background. But Emma Black, because she's photogenic, much more so than...
Are you saying they're objectifying her?
No, I'm saying that they're smart enough to realise that if they put a pretty girl at the front, then they're more likely to get good coverage, which they did, particularly on Sunrise and a lot of the
yes,
morning
that's
shows.
The image that I just showed.
Emma Black played fantastically to the press because she's like, waif-like blonde chick, right, fairly young, but she is, of course, a hardcore Marxist. She's a member of things. Melbourne Continental Philosophy Society, which is a bit of a nice way of saying sort of Marxist and associated philosophers.
Yeah, and she was on Sunrise with her Victorian Socialist shirt on as well.
Yeah, she's on Sunrise with the Victorian Socialist shirt. The Victorian Socialist was founded 2018 by Socialist Alliance, Socialist Alternative, and Stephen Jolly. Jerome Small stood for them in the federal election in Calwell. He got, I think it was 4-point-something%, which is actually pretty good for an openly Marxist group in Australia. It was not too bad, actually. Andrew Bolt made fun of him, saying that he didn't even get 5%, but openly Marxist groups don't have electoral appeal in Australia. They don't have the grassroots support that their media profile would suggest. I mean, that's kind of why they need to have so many boots on the ground.
And as I mentioned, Sky News, when I said they doxed the organisers, they published, or Andrew Bolt did, he published the press release with the organisers' names and their phone numbers as well. And that's on, contrary to what people disparagingly say. I mean, Sky News is a national news network, and so I wonder if they got some interesting phone calls during the week. But one of the, I'm not sure if he was organizer, but Jacob and Andre Werther.
He was one of the socialist. Yeah, he was one of the Socialist Alliance.
Yeah, Socialist Alliance. He is the screenshot from the interview.
Socialist Alliance was once the largest Marxist group in Australia. They have, because of repeated electoral defeats, they've never scored more than 1% in any election at a state or federal level, in any state or in any electorate. Because they put all their eggs in the electoral basket, and because they just continually kept getting beaten up, most of their people frittered away. But they've managed to hold on with a few people, and they threw their eggs into the Socialist Alternative basket for this. And in reward, I guess, they gave poor Jacob an interview, permission to do an interview with Andrew Bolt. If you look in the interview that Emma Black did with Sunrise, you can see Jacob sort of hanging around in the background hoping for his turn, which didn't happen.
Well, he did get his...
Socialist Alliance is very, very definitely the junior partner now. Socialist Alternative, the senior.
He grabbed hold of that interview with Andrew Bolt, which, of course, when Marxist socialists, they go up against anybody who doesn't agree with them, then it always ends with disaster. And, of course, Jacob said, this was democracy. And he basically was promoting a form of mob democracy, who can mobilize the most people on the street. And Andrew Bolt said, well, what if I wanted to come to your house to say how much I disagree with you? And it's like, it's a mobilization game. So basically he is saying here in the interview, I suggest everyone go and watch it, that we have some kind of street warfare to solve political disagreements, and apparently Melbourne should be run by warlords who control the various territories.
Well, it's the logic of Bolshevism. It's the logic of the early Bolshevik revolution. Most of the people in Russia didn't want to have a communist revolution, but the Bolsheviks did, and they had enough people on the streets of St. Petersburg. Or Petrograd.
Somebody said here, Jacob sounded very feminine.
The sort of logic they use. And that's the same logic that they use today. These people don't have a huge amount of imagination. Most of them are still running, if you go to their meetings, they're still running off the same texts that Lenin was writing in the early 1900s before the revolution even happened. They're still studying over those as though they're sacred scripture, the same way that Muslim would study the Quran. And this is the sort of the thing, like, these people are fanatics. They really are. They have a creed, they have an ideology, and they're not even shy about saying it, but journalists just do not even mention it. They don't even mention who these people are, what they believe, and the organisations that they belong to.
What I learned from Andrew Bolt's interview with young Jacob is that obviously he's, like I said, his view of democracy is street warfare. He would have no respect for the quiet Australians or the silent majority, which is this. How democracy works is that you vote in elections. You stand as a candidate. We had a federal election in May. We had a state election back in November 2018. The various socialist parties hardly got much of the overall vote. We do have a system of property rights. Well, obviously they don't respect private property rights, and so it's a you're asking a question to a brick wall. They don't believe that your home is your castle, and obviously the way we govern public properties such as roads and footpaths is that the governments that we elect enact laws and regulations about how they are operating, but this is where they twist what they term civil disobedience, and this is what a lot of the Extinction Rebellion people said, because the traditional way of protesting, putting your message out is, well, in the old days it used to be handing out flyers and magazines. That's of course what the Socialist Alliance have done with their Green Left weekly, and the Socialist Alternative one is Red Flag. And I think it was I can't remember if it was Piers Morgan or Nigel Farage when they were interviewing the Extinction Rebellion in the UK, basically saying nobody's listening to us, and because this is an emergency and we've got all these climate criminals around, we're forced to take this action. And so they don't define it as law breaking, it's civil disobedience. But of course, that's obviously... that's noble. Like, you believe that it's noble, but what if say a bunch of Australian nationalists superglued themselves to the Melbourne roads to protest further immigration, saying we're going to keep doing this until the immigration rate is cut to, say, 10,000 a year nationwide? I don't think that would be considered in the eyes of the media and other so-called free speech activists. I just saw a tweet from Sarah Hanson-Young. She's worried about freedom in Australia. Imagine if nationalists decided to do that, superglue themselves to protest mass immigration.
Well, of course. Right, it only goes one way, and that's the way they like it. I mean, and it is the journalists that allow them to get away with this. As you said, in our democratic system, people get to vote on whether or not they like Marxism. They get to vote every few years. And they routinely and emphatically vote no. Right? Even people who consider themselves on the far left usually vote for the Greens. Right?
And the Greens were there this week. Adam Bandt wouldn't say anything bad about the IMARC protesters, though he did, when he was addressing them, stress this is a peaceful protest.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. The Greens are able to get away with this. The Greens are able to involve themselves in what this wasn't like a large protest, like the gay marriage protest that the Socialist Alternative or Socialist Alliance had managed to latch on to and had organised a small part of it. This was entirely organised by the Marxist groups with a little bit of anarchist groups sort of tacked on, as they normally do. All right. The fact that the Greens were able to show up, that the deputy co-leader of the Greens, Adam Bandt, the former Senator Lee Rhiannon...
Is he still deputy co-leader? I can't keep up with who their various co-leaders are.
That's what Wikipedia says, so we'll go with that for now. But, yeah, and Samantha Ratnam, the head of the Victorian Greens, and Lydia Thorpe, their former lower house member in Victoria, all show up and speak at an event organised by a revolutionary communist group. And the media doesn't tell anybody. They're able to get away with this so repeatedly, over and over again, and so flagrantly and so openly, because the media simply doesn't even mention it.
Well, we will give some other credit here. Neil Mitchell and Tom Elliott on 3AW, they've been going pretty hard as well.
They are going hard, but they're not mentioning who these people actually are. I've seen, for instance, Neil Mitchell has interviewed Natalie Akerman, who was behind a lot of the Extinction Rebellion protests, and is again a Socialist Alternative organiser. And he didn't mention that she was from Socialist Alternative. Back during the protests against Milo Yiannopoulos, the same sorts of things. He was interviewing Ezekiel Ox, as he likes to be called. I think his real name's Alan Moran or something, who is again a member of Socialist Alternative, who is a spokesperson for that. Over and over and over again, people who are openly members of Socialist Alternative come forward as spokespeople for these sort of protests, for these campaigns, And nobody in the media does the simple Google search required to actually mention that they're a member of a group that wants to overthrow the government and abolish private property.
And that was the second part of Andrew Bolt's interview with Jacob.
It's about how much trouble that ditzy chick from Channel 7 got into when she interviewed Blair Cottrell and didn't mention that he was an evil person who shouldn't be interviewed. You think of the massive journalistic response to that. That this is an extremist. You can't not mention someone that is an extremist and try and present them as if they're a normal person. That normalises their ideas. Yet they do it over and over and over again with the most extreme political actors in our society. Over and over again. It never ends. Which is why I was so glad I had, a little bit of political orgasm over Andrew Bolt actually naming Jerome Small, Emma Black, and Jacob.
Yeah, and he went through. He'd actually done his homework with Jacob. You said this about that we should follow Cuba, and Andrew Bolt put the question like, when has socialism? When has it actually led to a prosperous society? And Jacob, he paused for a moment and then just went on with a capitalism sucks spiel. And I've listened to Andrew Bolt interview his opponents over the years. If somebody's not answering his question directly, Andrew Bolt re-asks it, hammers it again. You're not answering the question. It brings it right back. He's even though he's seen as a commentator, he's actually a pretty good interviewer. And of course, it was also Jacob. There was a lot of part of the questions he didn't understand, and he used a lot of filler words as well. He was sort of quite nonchalant.
Yeah. So Jacob is a recent sort of recruit to Socialist Alliance. If you've been to a university in Victoria in particular, but even across Australia now, over the course of the last 10 years or so, you would have seen almost zero posters or tables or people signing fake petitions and that sort of stuff from Socialist Alliance. But you would have seen hundreds from Socialist Alternative. Socialist Alternative has gotten most of the new young recruits for Marxists in Victoria over the course of this last decade. That's why they've managed to grow while Socialist Alliance has managed to shrink. The few recruits the Socialist Alliance have got, like Jacob, they're not the brightest bulbs in the drawer. Jacob is not a good spokesperson. There's a reason why when Sunrise called, they got Emma Black on, but when Andrew Bolt called, they got Jacob on. They didn't want Emma Black getting grilled by Andrew Bolt. He's got a relatively small audience on Sky, and it really wasn't worth their time. But throwing it off to the subsidiary group who's really only tagging along, and you want to throw them
desperate for publicity.
Sure, why not? Yeah, they are desperate for publicity. And this is the thing. I've read the internal minutes of the meetings that they did whilst they were planning this thing. They kept asking journalists to mention who they were over and over again for months. They were begging journalists, even invited friendly journalists to come to their meetings so that they could get briefed. And there was almost no news stories about them. All right? They were openly saying, we are planning a recreation of S11, the riots. All right,
yeah, their own words.
Their own words, repeatedly. They said it again and again. I think there was 3 news articles total in the 4 months leading up. And every single fortnight, every single week, every single meeting, right, they were actually talking to journalists, trying to say, we're going to do this. And the people who were talking to the journalists were openly, they held a, you can find the video of it online. I believe it's Box 4 or whatever that guy is who filmed some extremist events. They held a press conference and they invited every journalist they knew to come. And the 2 speakers were Emma Black, openly a member of Socialist Alternative. She recently wrote an article for Jacobin, the far left magazine, and her tag offline was, Emma Black is a member of Socialist Alternative. She's not hiding anything. And the other one was Cass Larkin, who recently stood in the federal election for Victorian Socialists and is an open member of Socialist Alternative again. It's like, there's only 2 people speaking at the press conference. Actually, there were 3, sorry. But 2 of them were members of Socialist Alternative. How do you not pick any of this up? How are you that blind? This is the largest group of political extremists in Australia. They organise about half the damn protests we have. How can you not figure this out at this point? You people are professionals. Right? You're being paid a half-decent wage. You've been picked out of the thousands and thousands of people who graduate out of journalism degrees every freaking year. Right? You were chosen. You were picked. You were elevated. Right? You were groomed. And you don't even do a Google search. These people are a disgrace. It is disgraceful. It is a scandal. It's the largest scandal in Australian journalism, and it is just a shame. And watching them scream and bitch and whine just because a journalist who didn't follow police instructions had 2 female cops grab him and try and move him out of the way. Oh no, the girls are beating you up, you big tough man in your nice tailored suit. Jesus Christ, these people are sickening.
It was shared by, I can't remember who the leftist on Facebook was, but it got a lot of attention when it was shared by Jews Against Fascism, which should basically be called Jews Against Avi Yemeni. He was there on the Tuesday. He got moved on for breaching the peace. It's funny that there was no outrage that citizen journalist Avi Yemeni was ejected from the demonstration, but they freaked out because a Victoria police officer was photographed doing the OK sign, which people have pointed out it's a Victoria police sign communication when they can't communicate verbally, and so, but they didn't get the memo that this always means now white supremacy, because the Anti-Defamation League in the United States decreed that, and so they didn't like that apparently his police number wasn't completely in view. And then they also got really triggered where they spotted another police officer here. He not only covered his name, badge and ID, but had a sticker saying "Eat a dick, hippie" over his body cam.
You see, firstly onto the nameplates and numbers and that sort of stuff, that comes from the S11 protest. Because just for those who don't know, S11 protest, Socialist Alternative was there then as well, but they were a small group back then. The main groups were the International Socialist Organisation, Socialist Alliance, the Socialist Party with Stephen Jolly, a whole bunch of small little socialist parties, and a large sort of anarchist confederation were the main groups that did the main organising stuff for S11 riots that happened in 2000. And during that, especially the anarchists, but also some of the Marxists, started grabbing police nameplates, ripping them off their uniforms.
Yikes.
The police took the nameplates off. Of course, this is against police regulations because they have to be able to be identified, which was later picked up by the Ombudsman and used as part of the case for why they should give compensation to the poor protesters that the policemen let. So it's them trying to pull the same sort of shit that they did with S11, essentially. With the OK sign, I'm going to be honest with you, man. I think the copper was actually taking the piss, mainly because of who he was doing the OK sign.
I saw
because of who he was doing the OK sign to.
Because the Australian Meditations Facebook page is back. That had the caption, "Make him police commissioner."
The person who took that photo, who has come out and boasted about taking that photo online, is Kim Stern. Kim Stern started off at Monash a few years ago as a member of Socialist Alternative Group there, along with Christy Pasquale, Catherine Robertson, and a whole lot of other people who have gone on to be sort of the middle tier of Socialist Alternative activists. Right? He recently moved up to ANU in Canberra and has sort of taken charge, I guess you'd say, of the Socialist Alternative unit up there in the ACT. And he travelled down here just to go to this protest. And you can see him in a whole lot of the protest pictures, particularly ones taken by the Age for some reason, where he's trying to hold back police, physically impeding police, trying to blockade things himself, and he's definitely there on the front line, just as Natalie Akerman was, Oliver Downs, who's the Socialist Alternative guy from La Trobe. There were so many Socialist Alternative people there. It's amazing. Absolutely incredible. But, so Kim was the one who took the photos. He shared them around. The Jews Against Fascism, which has lots of connections to the extreme left, particularly to anarchists. Right, then shared it around. And then the media saw it and shared it around as well, never asking where the photos came from or what their provenance was or why they were sharing a photo taken by a Marxist and shared by an anarchist group. The complete lack of any sort of rigorous investigation when it comes to the far left in Australia by Australia's journalists is just insane. They don't deserve their paychecks in any way, shape, or form.
I want to.
Even more.
Yeah, I can understand your frustration in venting, but I'll cut you off there because I want to go back to Victoria Police this week because, as I mentioned, the police hierarchy have defended to the hilt their officers' action this week, and it seems to have been Victoria Police they seem to have snapped this week, and they've said we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore because on Thursday nights I was watching 7 News, the police union is now going to take industrial action from December 1 where they're not going to issue revenue raising fines, which I think is excellent, and actually the police they're actually communicating there that we just collect these fines because we're ordered to on behalf of government, and we're going to hurt the government by not collecting the revenue for them, basically exposing like traffic fines and all that sort of thing as revenue raising exercises. So it's a massive indirect revelation there from the police union, but they're definitely. I'm not sure if you're seeing the same thing, but Victoria Police, they're definitely sick of just dealing with these street activists flouting the law. And of course, the police, they do release a lot of them, but some do end up getting to court, like the vegans, but they get no conviction and a $100 fine.
Yeah, you can't really blame the police for catch and release when every time they take these guys to court, they fill out all the paperwork and they actually put them in front of a magistrate. The magistrate lets them go with the slap on the wrist. It's absolutely nuts. The issue isn't with the police, it's with the judiciary. It has been for a very long time, particularly not with the rank and file police, who I think you saw a bit of frustration being released. I think you're right, Tim. I think it was, we've been putting up with this shit for a long time, from these people for a long time. And now these people are trying to disrupt a mining conference that Dan Andrews, the Premier of Victoria, has co-sponsored through the Victorian State Government. And Dan Andrews came out and was very fulsome in his praise of Victoria Police's actions.
Yeah, and was Lisa Neville as well.
Yeah, so pretty much the government has backed the police hierarchy who have backed their people for once. All right, and it really took a lot of the extremists who were protesting by surprise. You saw in a lot of their chat groups and a lot of their more public stuff that they did on Facebook, they're like, oh, they were all gentle when we were blocking roads, but now we're blocking a mining conference and they're all, vicious. And it's like, yeah, funny that, eh?
It's like their frustration and anger builds.
How long did you guys think you were going to be able to just pretty much spit in people's faces, which you were literally doing outside the event?
Yeah, they physically attacked police and police horses, which I said in my introduction. They're supposed to be protesting the Melbourne Cup next week because of animal cruelty. Because
of animal cruelty. Yeah, and if you saw the footage of where the police horse managed to hurt the 23-year-old Chilean activist who was there, the police horse went backwards because the other leftists were pushing it and then shocking it from the front. So it reared and went backwards onto her. And as anyone who's ever been around horses will tell you, yeah, not a good idea to stand directly behind a horse.
Now, as Jacob tried to say, it wasn't just the Marxist revolutionaries there. There were members of the Greens, which, well, we know what a lot of them believe deep down. But one group that wasn't present this week was Extinction Rebellion, because it's mainly Socialist Alternative have been basically at war with Extinction Rebellion for control over the climate change disruption protests. And you've spoken about previously that the left, they're very good at keeping their dirty laundry in-house, but there's been a Facebook page which has been airing their frustrations with Extinction Rebellion quite publicly. That is the Labour Wave initiative, which is connected to the Facebook blog page, rantings of a leftist beta cuck, and they've said Extinction Rebellion, they love capitalism, and the police, what pissweak people they are.
Well, yeah, a big part of it. It's less of a fight between Socialist Alternative and Extinction Rebellion, and more of a fight within Extinction Rebellion. If you saw the pictures from Monday, there were a lot of Extinction Rebellion flags there, but they were all being held by people from Extinction Rebellion Students and Youth, Extinction Rebellion RMIT, Extinction Rebellion La Trobe, Extinction Rebellion Melbourne University, which are all the Extinction Rebellion groups that Socialist Alternative set up.
Yes, so not actual Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah, so they're waving the Extinction Rebellion flag. So it's a battle for the brand name more than anything else. Socialist Alternative are a minority within Extinction Rebellion in Victoria, but as is usual as anyone who has been a part of any sort of left of centre movement, going back to the 1980s, going back to the anti-nuclear movement, knows, Trotskyists, their main tactic is to join a campaign as an organised group and then try and take it over. And that's exactly what Socialist Alternative have tried to do. And when Extinction Rebellion, the original Extinction Rebellion people, started pushing back against Socialist Alternative, that's when you started to see all these rants, right, about how they love capitalism and they love the police. Like, that was a big sort of split between the older Extinction Rebellion ones and the Socialist Alternative ones, was the fact that the older ones are like, well, we want to get arrested because it's our theory that if enough of us get arrested, that'll be a really good form of protest. So don't be mean to the police. They're helping us. Just cooperate. And Socialist Alternative believes the police are the sort of enforcers of the capitalist system. So they definitely don't believe that you should be nice to the police. They believe you should be as nasty to the police as you possibly can. And that it is ethically entirely okay to assault police, to beat up police, because they are the sort of the coercive instruments of an oppressive capitalist system. So there has been lots and lots of fights over that. Lots of fights over the fact that Socialist Alternative wanted to bring open borders arguments into Extinction Rebellion, which a lot of the greenie ones were just like, why? We're doing climate change stuff. Why are you talking about immigration and refugees? And as soon as they ask why, anyone who's ever tried to have a discussion with a Marxist will tell you, well, with one of these Trotskyists at least will tell you, right, the asking why was a bad idea. They exploded and started screaming, shouting, jumping up and down, and telling everyone about how they're not really activists. You're not really trying to fight the system. You're just tools of the system. You're just like everybody else.
I definitely...
Yeah. So the Extinction Rebellion didn't show up in large numbers to the IMAR protests, which kind of defeated the entire point that they were going for in the first place. In some of the internal minutes that were released a couple of weeks ago inside the IMAR organisers, they were actually saying, please, everyone try and reach out to the Extinction Rebellion people, please. We need them to get on board as well. Because they really did want to get, their original plan was to get 5,000 people. And their backup plan was between 1,000 and 5,000 people. They got about 400. And even they, in their planning meetings, because they'd done full surveillance of the building and they knew exactly what was being run and how it was being run, they got inside the email groups and internal organising stuff of the IMARC organisers. And so they were really well up on their intelligence and their planning. And they knew that they needed at least 3,000 or 4,000 people to actually blockade. I think it's something like 27 major and minor entrances. It's a huge building, the Convention Exhibition Centre.
Man, all those
so
months of planning they wasted.
Yeah. They planned for ages. And the whole idea was to bring people from Extinction Rebellion in, and they failed. They failed miserably. The majority of people who were there, Socialist Alternative people and adjacent.
Well, I
So
hope
Socialist
that this
Alternative
week
was there,
has
Socialist Alliance
been
was there, Socialist Party,
a
including Anthony May.
yeah, a tipping
Was there,
point in well, basically exposing who really is behind these so-called grassroots movement. I mean, well, got Andrew Bolt talking about it. That's a good start, and the fact that their numbers are diminishing. I'll wrap this up now, Lucas, because
No
when I
doubt.
have you on, you do get quite fired up, and but especially with your rantings against the mainstream media, I think you'll get total agreement from our audience here about their failures. That's why we're doing
Did I mention
the
the media?
Unshackled. Sorry?
Did I mention the media? Oh,
Yes,
thought I
the
might
main,
have forgotten.
yes. Yeah, but keep an eye out for, because they're not going to give up or
There's so much more news coming. It's all going to come through to the Unshackled website.
yeah.
So everybody make sure they stop in and read up on what our favourite friends on the far left are doing these days.
Take care, Lucas. Keep up the great work, and we'll chat again soon.
Will do, Tim. Thank you for having me on.
So these Friday night shows are getting quite epic. Now, before we wrap up, because it is close to 9 o'clock Melbourne time, as you all know, I didn't have a show last Sunday evening because I went and saw the Joker movie with my escort for the evening. I posted a photo of who that was on my Facebook page and a Gab account, so you can guess who it was. But yeah, it definitely lived up to expectation. The Joker movie, and it's one of the reason why it's hated by the elites, the mainstream media, and of course social justice warriors, is because it exposes who they really are. That they've created people like the Joker. And it's interesting because one of the main villains in that movie is the talk show host played by Robert De Niro. And I'm surprised that Robert De Niro accepted this role, because I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but he mocks the Joker's comedy routine. And you see this a lot of these sort of alleged comedy or commentary shows. They tend to, if somebody is acting silly in a viral video, they'll mock it, even though that person is way below them. And of course, the Joker is invited on the show, and I won't give away the ending. But during his appearance on the show, the Joker basically says to the talk show host, like, this is how you see society. And that's when he says his famous, my life is not a tragedy, it's comedy, because everything's subjective. You've just decided that a society functions in a certain way. And you actually see during the movie an actual working class revolution born. Of course, the philosophy of Marxism was created by a member of the bourgeois. All of the Marxist revolutions, they come in countries throughout the 20th century. They all came from the intellectual, educated people, a lot of them having privileged upbringings. And so it wasn't actually what Marx wrote about the spontaneous rise up of the proletariat. And of course, if you look at the Antifa and the revolutionaries today, they're all white and come from privileged backgrounds. But in the Joker movie, you actually see what is a genuine people's revolt, not one organized by some rich kid who suddenly wants to fight the system. And that, of course, freaks them out because it's not something that they created. And of course, one of the people that bully the Joker is a bunch of investment merchant bankers. And obviously, the in the Batman comics, the Joker is the villain to Batman, who is Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne is a young boy in this movie, and his father, Thomas Wayne, is running for mayor. And Thomas Wayne says, "Oh, these people are the dregs of society, the ones protesting. I'm their only hope. I know better than them." Basically, the elitist thing that the working class, I only know what's good for them. They listen to me, and their failure is their own fault. So it's basically that the elites know best, and our whole society at the moment is completely based on merit. There's no nepotism or you'd say elites. And so Thomas Wayne, he's portrayed in quite a crass negative light, and there is during the movie hints about elites covering up their various crimes and indiscretions, which sort of reminds you of something that's been in the news the past few months, that Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself, but that's what we're told. And of course, supposedly the people like Thomas Wayne, they say that they're the compassionate, tolerant people, but as we all know, they're the biggest bullies that exist in society. As social justice warriors, they say they claim about the poor and the downtrodden and the vulnerable, yet they're the ones who are calling white people poor white trash. If obviously, I was just talking about before, Movember, men's mental health. A lot of them think it's good that men are suffering because they've got male privilege and they need to suffer. That's how cruel-minded a lot of these people now. And so this is why I was so amazed that the Joker was allowed to be made, because it exposes the fraud that the elites and the mainstream media and the social justice warriors have perpetrated on us, and allows basically the demonized, not just white man, but who they think are the privileged elite people, which it's, as it's called, it's an upside down world. And you're noticing now that this is why they hated the Joker so much, is because the Joker's laugh by Joke Phoenix, and of course the line, "It's not a tragedy, it's a comedy," is now seeping into popular culture now. That's why they hate it so much. And it's also red-pilling normies, because I got my tickets from the box office from a young white lady who said to me, "Oh, it's one of the best movies I've ever seen." And I'm pretty sure she's just a box office usher at a movie theatre. She's probably not political at all, but she's seeing the message, and this is also what they hate, that normies are getting indirectly red-pilled by this movie and will maybe look at things differently. That terrifies them. Obviously, they fear people like us, but they think they think that they can control us. But what about all the other? Because the Joker has become one of the highest grossing horror movies that was ever made, and obviously because a lot of normies are seeing it, and that's what scares them so much, and why they will not want another movie like that again. And again, obviously Robert De Niro, I go back to him. I don't know why I accepted that role, because he is the fuck Trump guy, which shows that he probably doesn't have actually much self-awareness when it comes to his own acting. But also the role of Thomas Wayne, it was originally going to be played by Alec Baldwin, who of course plays Donald Trump on Saturday Night Live. And so obviously he pulled out Alec Baldwin, not because he disapproved of the role, because of a scheduling conflict. But I think that would have been epic if Alec Baldwin had played Thomas Wayne with no self-awareness that he's actually playing himself. So yes, it was an incredible movie experience. You'd give it probably 4.8, 4.9 stars out of 5. There's not often that a movie engrosses you so much. It was perfect. Like, the score was perfect, cinematography, it was incredibly well directed, produced. Everything else about it was was excellent, and it definitely deserves the accolades, not just for the message, but for basically just how well acted and produced it was. Well, I've gone over 9 p.m. Melbourne time, so I'll wrap this up on a Friday night. At this stage, I don't know whether I will be doing a Sunday show, so I will, if I am doing one, of course, I'll do a promo in the afternoon, and often on Sunday evenings, the show is a bit later on in the evening, just because Sundays are a bit hectic for me. But obviously, I do promote WilmsFront as being on Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday night, so I try to bring you a Sunday show as much as I can. This is your last opportunity to ask a question or send through a super chat on Entropy. I'll put the link in again. And of course, I end every WilmsFront program and every other show that I co-host with the obvious reminders. So this concludes the Australian alt media primetime lineup for this week. There is no Dear Beltran debate on Sunday either. So Monday night, 9 p.m. Melbourne time, it's XYZ Live on the Maddie Rose Live YouTube channel. Then, of course, I'm back on Tuesday evening, 7 p.m. Melbourne time with Trans Tasman Talk with my New Zealand counterpart, Dewey de Boer from rightminds.nz, where we compare the news in both of the Tasman nations. And then WilmsFront is on 7 p.m. Melbourne time, Wednesday night on the Tim Wilms YouTube channel. Right before Dear Beltran's weekly live stream, which is at 8:15 p.m. Melbourne time over on her Dear Beltran live channel. And then, of course, the standout gem of the Australian alt media lineup, which is the Uncuckables live every Thursday on its dedicated YouTube channel at 8:30 p.m. We just had another successful episode last night with myself, David Hiscock, editor of the XYZ, and Ben Chan, the Dusty Bogan. You can check out the live replay on YouTube, and you can also access the podcast form at theuncuckables.com. Of course, my colleague Steel Archer, he hosts Detonation most weekday mornings Melbourne time on his dedicated Detonation YouTube channel. He has his own show website now at steelarcher.com. And of course, WilmsFront, it has the archive of episodes at timwilms.com, and also links to the podcast version of the show, so you can subscribe to it on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn Radios, and a whole bunch of others as well. Please follow me on social media, facebook.com/WilmsFront, twitter.com /WilmsFront, minds.com/TimWilms, and gab.com/TimWilms. And remember, if you want to support this show and also support the work of the Unshackled.net, we have the web membership program over on the Unshackled at the Unshackled.net/membership. Also, our donation form at the Unshackled.net/donate. We're still on the existing crowdfunding platform, so patreon.com/theunshackled, subscribestar.com/theunshackled, and paypal.me/theunshackled. And of course, all of WilmsFront episodes will soon be moving to Rational Rise TV, the self-hosted video website set up by James Fox Higgins from the Rational Rise. You can also check out his channel for occasional content up at the moment. So you should never, ever watch the mainstream media again. So it was another epic Friday night show. I'm off to relax now. And remember, Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself. So that's my final word for tonight, and I will see you on the next WilmsFront.
Thanks for tuning in to WilmsFront. Visit timwilms.com or Rational Rise TV to view the archive of episodes. And keep visiting the Unshackled.net to view all our shows, and to keep up with the latest real news and analysis.